has long been an ethnically and religiously plural region, thanks to its participation in both overseas and coasting trade since very early times. We have, though, very limited evidence for a significant Jaina presence in the region prior to the 14th century. This, however, would change dramatically with the period of the rise of the Vijayanagara Empire, when Kannur would witness a sudden and remarkable efflorescence of Jaina activity. Due to its strategic location, Kannur was soon absorbed into the fledgling Vijayanagara Empire, becoming its primary international trade link, providing access to essential commodities, the most important of which was a steady supply of horses from Arabia and Persia. With Vijayanagara's extension into the zone, Kannur's long line of regional kings quickly faded into obscurity, to be replaced by a multi-layered structure of interlocking local and extraterritorial tiers of authority. The Vijayanagara overlords kept governors in the port cities of Mangalore, Barkur, and Honavar, but the bulk of the territory was left to the direct administration of a constellation of semi-autonomous chieftains, most of whom were Jaina. These small Jain polities were numerous, but the more expansive and powerful included the Nagiri and Hadavali chiefs in the north. I'll try not to look back and forth. And the Khalsa Karkala, Chauta, Bunga, and Ajila chiefs in the south. The third important tier of authority that arose during the period was an array of merchants' guilds that in many ways facilitated the economic transactions that bound center to periphery. Needless to say, this complex political, economic, and administrative structure was a careful balancing act, one that could be maintained only through continual renegotiation between the parties. One of the more conspicuous arenas, I argue, in which these negotiations were enacted was through the patronage of monumental religious architecture. Today, I will present two distinct types of Jain bastis built in the region and propose that they were employed to dramatically different ends in these political negotiations between Kannur's Jain chieftains and their extraterritorial overlords. The epigraphic records and built forms of these temples reveal details of their patronage and symbolic programs that help us to reconstruct how Kannur's Jain chieftains sought to position their fledgling polities in the period of the Vijayanagara Empire. While the precise origins of the various Jain chieftains that suddenly burst onto Kannur's political stage in the 14th century remains a largely open-ended question, we can be relatively certain that they did not arrive to the region through her seaports, but rather from the interior. Exclusively Digambra, they frequently referenced in their inscriptions and artistic productions Jaina institutions above the Ghats, and in so doing laid claim to the rich history of Jainism in upland Karnataka. The clearest of these references was certainly the colossal sculpture of... The clearest of these references was certainly the colossal sculpture of Gomateshwara, erected atop a granite hill in Karkala in 1432. That's the one on the left is what I'm talking about. In 1432 by Virapanda, the second chief of the Khalsa Karkala dynasty. The construction was, of course, an unabashed imitation of the 10th century Gomata at Shravanbelagola, and it was more than a mere tribute. In his foundation inscription, the patron assumes the name Abhinava Chamundaraya after the original builder, laying claim to the Ganga royal legacy and signaling his intent to relocate the epicenter of South Indian Jainism to his own capital city below the Ghats. The capital Karkala, like the majority of the Jaina political and religious centers in Kannur, was located well inland, strategically situated to control access to important passes through the Ghats and to the plateau beyond. Located at these critical nodes along the trade routes connecting Kannur's ports to the enormous inland vent of Vijayanagara, the Jaina chieftains and the influential commercial guilds based in their capitals were major players in the booming mercantile economy of the period. It was in this function of middlemen, facilitating the movement of goods through the hinterland, that the Jaina chieftains were of crucial importance to the Vijayanagara kings. And keeping the control of this hinterland fragmented amongst the various chieftains was also critical. As long as they could be played off one another, no one would gain enough power to threaten the continued flow of trade between the ports and the capital. As is probably well known to this audience, Vijayanagara had what is often described as a tolerant attitude towards Jainism. Frequently cited is the famous Jaina Sri Vaishnava Accord of 1368, in which Bukka I recognized Jaina and Vaishnava dharmas as of equal status. But it is clear that Jainism, certainly throughout the period of Vijayanagara's first dynasty, the Sangamas, was more than simply tolerated. It was, rather, a conspicuous feature at the uppermost levels of Vijayanagara society. Jains were employed in the realm's highest offices as ministers, generals, and provincial governors, and a number of the Sangama kings and their families were generous patrons of Jaina institutions at the capital and elsewhere throughout the empire. There's a reference to that 2 talks ago, I think. The survival in various states of preservation of seven Jain temples at the capital, most of which were built in close proximity to the royal center, demonstrates the prestige of this community. We see 2 of these here on the left, the so-called Ganagiti temple to Kuntu Jinanatha of 1386, founded by Irugappa Dandanayaka, the most prominent member of a Jain family that served several of the Sangama kings, and the Parshvanatha Chaitya of 1426, built at the orders of the Vijayanagara monarch Devaraya II. Royal and noble patronage of Jainism was not limited to the Sangama dynasty, for we have records of Krishnadevaraya making grants to Jain institutions in the 16th century. But the early period certainly was its heyday. It was during the early 15th century, and in the reign of Devaraya in particular, as we shall see, that Vijayanagara seems to have been most actively engaged with ensuring its good relations with Kannada Jain chieftains. One of the few sites in Kannada where we have evidence for Jain activity predating the Vijayanagara period is Waranga, where the institution, if not the current structure, of the Neminatha Basti appears to date to the turn of the 13th century. The first patrons of this temple were members of the Jain Shantra dynasty, based above the Ghats at Humcha, and by the 14th century, Waranga would become an important sacred center for the Khalsa Karkala dynasty, who were themselves an offshoot of the Shantras. From their capital at Karkala, these chieftains regulated 2 important routes through the Ghats, and control of Waranga meant command over the crucial Agumbe Ghat, connecting the imperial port city of Barkur to the plateau. Given the strategic importance of the site, we should not be surprised to learn that the Vijayanagara crown soon sought to form a bond with its premier institution. In 1424, Devaraya II made a grant to the Neminatha Basti, an endowment renewed by Krishnadevaraya in 1515. In so doing, these Vijayanagara kings joined the imperial center in a collective effort of patronage with the local chieftains and trade guilds. Waranga's Neminatha Basti, I argue, is the earliest surviving example of a phenomenon in Kannada where bonds between the potentially rival tiers of authority were formed and reaffirmed through cooperative patronage of important Jain institutions. In this way, Jain Bastis served as sites for political and economic negotiation, processes that were multi-party and open-ended. I argue that the configuration of the majority of Jain Bastis in the region, longitudinally oriented and thus easily expandable, was formally conducive to such cooperative composite endeavors. This is not to say that all longitudinally oriented Jain Bastis were used to this purpose, nor that longitudinally oriented Hindu temples could not serve similar aims, but only that, following on precedents like the Waranga Chaityalayam, this became the favored typology for literally building consensus.